All right, so I've got a boilerplate React app up and running because we're gonna we're gonna create a little. Remember the counter, the clicker app or cookie clicker app, our little counter app that we did like one of the very first days of React where we clicked it a bunch of times and it increased. Well, we're gonna do that, but we're gonna leverage the context API. So we're really used to what we've been doing so far is passing down props and state down via props. So some state value is some state in the parent component, and we can pass that value down as props to a child component. So here's an example. Component 3 passes down props, take that props, and we can keep passing it down the tree. What the context API or the context hook, called the context API, is extract state out of the component tree, and you're able to pass it in anywhere within the component tree where you desire. You give every component access to state or to the context wherever you want it to have access to. So you can read through it. It is a little confusing, but the syntax is also kind of new, but let's talk about that. So I've got my my boilerplate React app up and running. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a components directory, and I'm going to create two components, a button component and a counter component. What the hell? Counter.js. Don't save. All right. So in the button component, I'm just going to literally have a button initially. What is going on here? It says click me. And in the counter, I'm going to display like some counter value. All right. And then in my app.js, I'm going to get rid of all of this stuff. And I'm going to import the counter component and the button component. So I've got the button and a counter. So if I look over here, I've got the counter component and the button component. And my goal is to, when I click this, update the counter value. So where do we need to store that counter state, like the value of the counter? Where do we need to store that?
App.js.
And why do we need to store that in app.js?
Because it's like the central location, so it can be passed up from counter and then passed back down to button. Yep. Or vice versa.
Yep. So we're going to store the counter state in app.js so we can pass not only the value to the counter, which is going to display some counter like 1, but we also want to be able to update counter when we press the click me to update that value, the counter value, so it reflects in our counter component. So I'm going to say import use state from React. And then in here, I'm going to do const count, set count, and the initial value, use state. I'm going to have an initial value of 0. So I'm going to pass this count down as props to the counter component. So count equals count. Like so. So it's passed down as props. So now I can take the props. I can deconstruct it if I want, or I can just access props directly. And I'm going to display props.count where the H1 tag is. So now you can see I've got 0 showing up right there. But now I want to be able to click this button that exists in the button component and have it update the count state in the parent component. And I want that to be passed down to the counter component to reflect in the counter component and right here. I can either pass set count down directly, or I can just make a separate function, says like const update. I can say like increase. I'll just say increase. And this increase will set count. I don't know if this will actually work, but let's try it out. And it's going to do count plus 1. And so I'm going to pass increase down as props to the button component. And when I click me on that on button or that button, I can have an on click. And props.increase. So when I click this button, it runs the increase function from the app component, which sets count, which increases count by 1. Let's see if this works. It might not work. There it goes. So it is working. So any questions on how that is working? No questions? All right. So this is like the old, not old way, but this is perfectly acceptable. You're free to develop your React apps just like this. But when your apps get bigger and bigger, you just passing down props and state down the component tree, it could get a pretty exhausting, and just kind of keeping track of where all the data is. So what the context does is extracts state, pretty much just extracts whatever you want out of the state and puts it in its own part of the application. And with that, you're able to inject count and state directly into the button component or the counter component. So let's do that. So inside the source, we have components, but I'm going to create another directory called context. And inside of there, I'm going to create the counter context.js.
Hey, Tom.
Yep.
Is this what you were talking about the other day when you were showing us the production code and you said that sometimes they hold their state in a separate entity?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And I think I've asked before, has anybody heard of like React Redux or Redux before? Redux, yep, Redux does the same thing as context, but Redux came before context and all that was even developed with React. So React kind of is doing that, can also handle that now. But Redux is still very popular, and you'll see it probably be more so than the context in React. But this is another way, like another way to decouple your state from your components in your own little context or own little store. So in here, how do I want to do this? There's, from a syntactical perspective, there's several ways you can do it. Some ways it's kind of nasty and dirty. Other ways is cleaner. I'm going to do it the way I like to do it. That allows that I just think is a little cleaner. So, yeah. So I'm just going to import. Where is this? So I've got context. When to use context. You can read through the documentation. So here's an example. So this is all done in the same file here, though. They create a context. So there's a function that creates a context. And that is just kind of like where to store that, what data to store in a specific part of the file. And you want to name your context based on the type of data that's going in there. So you'll have like a user context that stores user information. You'll have a post context that stores post information. You'll store kind of, you want to keep them separate. So you can have multiple contexts, or you should have multiple contexts the more you expand your app. Such as like in a news site, might have like a post context as well as a separate user context. So here's an example. We create a context, and this one just has a value of light, and they're calling it theme context because this is, you can pass down a theme of what you want an application to be, such as dark theme, light theme, whatever. And down here, we have a toolbar that probably shows some information. Just think of toolbar as a random component. And you wrap your component that you want to have access to the context or the theme context with a theme context dot provider. So theme context has a dot provider that provides the values from the context down to the child components, the children components like this. And it always has a value, and this value can be multiple values. So it can be an object that store multiple values. This is just an easy way to do this. Or just this one just has a simple light context, and you can pass those values down. So now toolbar, if you come down here, toolbar has a themed button, and the themed button can subscribe to that context like this. But this is all class-based components. This is probably a little too much, but I'm gonna do it a little bit easier. So I'm gonna say use context, use state, from React. All right. So I'm going to create a context, a counter context. So just like they're doing up here, where'd it go? Theme context. I'm going to create a counter context, but I'm going to export it. So I have access to this export const counter context equals, oh, sorry, this shouldn't be use context. This should be create context. Create context. And I'm going to have this be empty initially. And now I'm going to create a component that looks like any other kind of component, but there's some minute differences. So if we think like we're creating just like another component, like a functional based component, but I'm not going to call this component const counter context provider. So this is just naming conventions. I'm going to call it context provider, counter context provider, because this component is essentially going to do what kind of this part is doing, where the theme context dot provider I don't like doing it like this, where you're passing stuff in, and you're going to see it in new site 6. It's kind of done like this, but I'm going to create this component that takes in props. And I'm going to create some state in here. I'm going to const count, count, set count equals use state. Initial value is 0. And just like any functional based component, I'm going to return. And now here in this component, this counter context component, I'm going to do this syntax right here, where it says theme context dot provider, and I pass in some value. I'm going to do counter context dot provider, and the value I'm going to be passing in is going to be an object called with the count and set count. And I can pass in whatever values I want down here. I can do that handle const increase. Actually, maybe I'll do that. Set count plus 1. And maybe I'll pass down increase instead of set count because it does the same thing. So now I've got this provider, which is going to provide the children of this component values to the count and increase functions. So you may have not seen this before, but I can pass down props.children like this. And what this is going to do is if I wrap a component with this component, it's going to give all the child components. It's essentially doing this and passing in like counter or whatever. It's going to just pass in my child components down here. Then I'm going to export default counter context provider. I know it's kind of a lot, but just know like right here is where I'm creating the state that I'm going to be passing down to other components. So now what components do I want to have access to count and increase? Does anybody know?
The button and the display. I can't remember what it was called.
Counter, right? So I want to give count and increase. I want counter and the button components to have access to these values. So I'm providing these children components that haven't been defined yet to the count and increase value. So wherever I'm invoking counter and button, which is inside of app.js, I'm going to wrap counter context provider with those like so. So counter context provider, again, it's just like a component, but I'm wrapping them in counter and button. So think of counter and button are passed in as props to the counter context provider. And now right here is where counter and button are being wrapped. So right here, that's essentially what I'm doing right here. This is equivalent to this part. So I don't need that or that. So I can get rid of this now as well. And that. So now how do I actually access the counter? How do I actually access this count value that I'm passing in into this counter component? Well, if I go to the counter component, I can import the use context hook. And now in here, I can extract count const count equals use context. But what context do I want to pass into that? I want to pass in this counter context. So I can just pass in the counter context in there. And now I have access to count, which comes from here, which is this value right here. So now I don't need that. And I can also access increase if I want, or I can access whatever I want from the counter context. So I can do the same thing. So if I look over here, 0 is being displayed. If I make this, 50, 50 is being displayed because 50 is being set to state in the counter context provider component, which is right here. I'm providing the count and the increase function to the provider, and I'm going to pass it down to my children. So inside of app.js, I've got this counter context provider component that's solely responsible for passing the count and increase down to its children. So I'm wrapping the counter button child and the button child in the counter context provider component. So now these two components, the counter and the button, have access to these values. So I could use the count in here if I want or not, but I'm choosing to. So I'm accessing the counter context directly. Now I can do the same thing with the button. I can import use context. I can import the increase function from the use context, counter context, like so. And now instead of props.increase, I'm just accessing the increase function directly. So now, if I clicks me, everything still works. So I don't have to worry about passing things down from state and props or anything like that. But if I moved the button outside of the counter context, now button doesn't have access to count or increase. So when I'm trying to access it here, it's not going to be able to. See right here. Button, consider adding an error boundary, blah, blah, blah. Deconstruct property, doesn't know what that is. If I wanted to add it, perhaps maybe I wanted to add another function in here, const alert. I could say alert. This is coming from the counter context. Alert user, I'll say that. And now I can pass that alert user like so. And now this button also has access to that alert user. So I can also grab the alert user. Issue an alert. So now if I refresh that, click alert, I have access to that as well. What questions do you have about the context API. Would you like me to refactor it a little bit to kind of how you're going to see it tomorrow or on Saturday?
Yes.
Right.
It makes sense. And essentially what this does is it gives you almost a state component that you can pass around and use. Yes?
Yeah. Yep. So, yeah, that's what this does. So maybe I don't want to use this part. So in the create context directly, I'm going to directly create the state. So I'm going to say count equals 0, set count, which is going to, what is set count? I can make a function. I'm just going to console log count initially. Whoop. Actually, that's not going to work. So what you're going to have to do, I can add like name, or I guess I want that alert user. All right. So let's see how we do this. So I'm going to remove all that, just comment that out. So export default. Oh. Like that. And then in here, I'm going to comment that out and just import the counter context. And then in here, counter, instead of counter context provider, dot provider, dot provider. And let's see if ever 2 errors. Let's see what the errors are. Use state is never used. Let's see. Oh. One error. I haven't done this yet, so let's see. I might run into issues. All right. All right, not getting it. Value prop is, oh, so just like in here, where I'm passing down the value, I also need to pass down the value. All right, why isn't that working? Let's look at the documentation. Theme context. So do I need to create? Let's check it out. I'm missing something easy. Let's see. Oh. Oh. Counter context provider. Should have access to those. Why doesn't it not? Oh, hold on. I'll have to debug it. I'm not quite sure off the top of my head because I'm going to have to pass in values down. Let's look at the documentation real quick. So I've got create context. So this is hard coding the value.
You need to use props dot on the variables, or should they work without it?
No, they should work without it. Thing button thing. I wonder if I just do. So this is why I kind of like using the other one this way is because you automatically have access to all this stuff. Let's look at new site 6. So we create that context. So in here, yeah, so this is hard coding those values. Let's see. This is the ugly way to do this. Yeah. So you'll see it tomorrow. I'm not going to spend that much time with this part, but ooh. This is, I would prefer this way. It'll make your life easier. And it's probably more practical to do it this way. Like so. Because the other way it hard codes from state, which kind of defeats the purpose. But yeah. Sorry, I couldn't get that to work with this counter thing. Does anybody have any questions on this? So another thing you'll hear or see if you really get into it, we got this context provider, which we kind of already talked about. But if we go down here to this context consumer, don't use this. I mean, so the use context, this line of code and this hook do the same thing as this context dot consumer. So they're kind of interchangeable. But the syntax of the consumer is really ugly relative to just this. If you didn't do this, you'd have to do something like. Whoop. Just see what that looks like. Probably gonna throw an error. Yeah, I'd never used that just because it's really nasty. Anyway, still getting errors. All right, now what's going on? Why isn't this working anymore? Anybody know? Cannot deconstruct count. What just happened? Oh. Duh. All right, that should be good. So that's kind of how the context works. So, we have any questions? So we kind of got derailed there, trying to convert it the other way.
Your function on line 8 called increase, that's really just designed to like protect state from being changed.
Yeah,
No.
I can literally pass that in there.
What do you call that when you're protecting state like that?
I'm not quite sure. Is it like decoupling? Yeah, I don't know. It's called something though. And you might not just give access to set state or set count directly. Also decrease. Then counter button. So yeah. Anywho, a call.